Hello and welcome to PocketGamer.biz's weekly news digest. This is for the week ending the 13th of February 2015. Hi, I'm Jon Jordan. So this week we're again kind of still, as last week, well into the financial season where companies are announcing their figures. We've kind of got figures from companies all over the world now. So we've got Americans and Koreans and Japanese and Chinese all firing away kind of figures. And I thought this week, because there were some interesting trends going on with just a couple of companies, I thought I'd kind of dive into a bit more kind of detail on what was going on with these companies. So I've got my little cheat sheet, so when I'm looking down, that's what I'm doing with my cheat sheet. But the first company I thought I'd look at is King. So we all know King for Candy Crush Saga. Candy Crush Saga originally on Facebook and then came to mobile and was a really kind of big game changer for King. So it announced its 2014 figures. And annual sales were $2.4 billion. Clearly an enormous amount of money. We just have said it from the start, and King is a very, very profitable company. It just generated $670 million of cash. It actually bought back, I think, $150 million of shares. It's paid out a dividend. It's paying out another dividend. It's bought another development company for up to $150 million. So it's just very cash kind of positive. But there's some trends happening with King that we need to look at. So kind of one of them is just kind of how kind of quarter on quarter kind of sales are happening. So let me check my cheat sheet. So if you look at the bookings, so the bookings for Q4, so Q4 is October to the start of October to the end of December 2014. So its bookings were $586 million, and that's kind of how much kind of revenue was generated in terms of people kind of buying currency. That's kind of interesting that year on year, so compared to the previous compared to the same period of time in 2013, bookings were actually down. So that number was actually down 7%. Kind of what's happened there is we all know what's happened. Candy Crush Saga was a massive game, but kind of massive games kind of tend to peak and then drop off. So Candy Crush Saga is in a mature phase now. So it had more bookings this time last year. But if we look on quarter, so if we compare the October-December quarter to the July-September quarter, bookings were then actually up 8%. So kind of what we're seeing is a kind of a cyclic behaviour where kind of Candy Crush Saga kind of peaks and then drops off, but equally now King releases Candy Crush Soda Saga, which is kind of part of the same franchise. So you kind of see these kind of trends happening where it drops off kind of year on year, but there's actually kind of growth happening in a more kind of quarter on quarter level. And we can kind of see this partly because King is very nervous because it's now a stock company. You can buy shares in King. Shares aren't actually doing very well compared to when it floated. But now King actually breaks out what it calls non-Candy Crush Saga revenue. So that's basically the revenue it has from games that aren't Candy Crush, because Candy Crush has been such a large proportion. And actually what we're seeing, and kind of what I guess shareholders want to see, is that proportion, non-Candy Crush Saga revenue is growing very fast. So non-Candy Crush Saga was $324 million in the quarter. And that's actually up 23% kind of quarter on quarter. So we're kind of seeing that kind of King is kind of showing people that it can actually sustain the Candy Crush franchise with releasing kind of other games, but equally it's kind of got other franchises that aren't Candy Crush that it can kind of have that revenue generation of, and obviously it needs to see growth in that as well. But kind of behind those, we've kind of seen some other trends. So King originally mainly made its money from Facebook, and now it's becoming more of a mobile kind of company. And kind of what we're seeing in kind of the peak from 2013, those quarters that were higher, so this quarter last year, 2013, was higher, but that was not really because mobile sales haven't really dropped off. What's happened is Facebook sales have dropped off. So if you look at the underlying Facebook's mobile sales, they have dropped quarter on quarter and then picked up again. But basically the decline that's kind of happened year on year has happened because the Facebook business has collapsed, but the Facebook business is in decline and it's not going to go up again, whereas the mobile business, as more mobile titles are released and King focuses more on mobile, is going to go up. So I guess that's a positive thing in the sense that its mobile business, King's mobile business is increasing and it's spending more time doing that. Another kind of interesting thing, which is kind of part of the same kind of structural scenario, is if you look at the number of people. So King, like a lot of these companies, breaks out it's what they call monthly active users and daily active users. So that's the amount of people who are playing its games within that basis. It also breaks out what it calls monthly unique users, which is obviously uniques rather than people coming back many times. But it also breaks out monthly unique payers. So what we've kind of seen over the past 2 years is that the number of payers it has within its system is declining, kind of fairly rapidly actually. But it also breaks out, and this is a bit of a mouthful, it breaks out what it calls its monthly gross average basically revenue per unique per player. And actually what's happening is that is increasing faster than the decline of unique players. So partly they've changed slightly some of the monetization mechanics, so they're going for a more currency approach, so that encourages people to spend more, but less people are encouraged to spend. But actually what we're seeing for King is it's actually some positive trends, that it's actually monetizing its players at a high level, and it's actually monetizing more on mobile, has more mobile players, and it's actually seeing more non-Candy Crush games making money. So that's a kind of interesting trend, digging beneath just the fact that King makes a lot of money. So two other companies very different to King. So two of the big Korean companies announced their revenue, again 2014 revenue this year. So there's Gamevil and the Com2uS. Now it's kind of an interesting situation that Com2uS is the bigger company. So Com2uS is its sales were $216 million in 2014. Gamevil, its sales were $131 million, but Gamevil actually owns a controlling stake in Com2uS. It doesn't own the majority of shares, but it owns a majority of kind of voting shares, so effectively it has control. So they're kind of joint companies, even though they run separately, if you see what I mean. So, what's kind of interesting about them is Com2uS is the bigger company. At the moment, pretty much the majority of its growth is happening outside of Korea. So 73% now of its revenue it happens internationally outside of Korea, and the majority of that is happening in APAC region. So particularly kind of China, Japan, Thailand, Taiwan, and some other kind of countries in Southeast Asia. So North America is not particularly big; it's about 15%, and Europe about the same. Not particularly big for Com2uS, and it's just kind of seeing this kind of massive growth outside of Korea and within this kind of China, Japan kind of area. Now Gamevil is almost the exact opposite. So 61% of its revenue comes out of Korea. International is not a particularly big deal for it. It's not particularly. I mean, everyone's looking at China. It's not particularly gone into China in a big way. You know, North America and Europe again are kind of solid, but not growing particularly fast. And it's seeing, even though the Korean market is Korea is a small country. It's seeing the majority of its growth coming from that. So you're seeing these two companies operating in the same based in the same country, but operating in a completely different way, and both having massive success. Now, what's interesting about that is that, like a lot of companies, they're seeing it's a winner-takes-all scenario. So both these companies actually have kind of previously operated in a portfolio kind of impact. So they've developed their own games. They've also published games from other smaller developers. They've kind of had a portfolio effect. They've released, maybe a dozen games a year, maybe 20 games a year in some cases, but we're kind of seeing that kind of scenario dying off now, because what you're seeing is a winner-takes-all scenario. So you're seeing a big game. It's easy to get more money out of a big game. It's easy if you have a game that's doing $10 million a year, it's easy to get $11 million out of that game than it is to make a new game and get $1 million out of that. So we're kind of seeing a concentration of resources from all companies, not just in Korea, but on the big hits they're having. And what's interesting is the big hits for both companies are actually broadly the same, because they're Korean based, so they're kind of the developers are keen on the same thing. So RPG is clearly massive in Asia, so for Com2uS, its big game is Summoner's Wars, and that's had 30 million downloads now, and that's generating the majority of its revenue. But its other big game is Ace Fishing, which is not kind of a genre you kind of think would be very big, and then it's very similar with Gamevil. So it broke out its top 5 games were generating 69% of all sales. So it's just 5 games generating 69% of sales. 3 of those were RPGs. So there's Dragon Blaze, Monsters Warlord, a few others. But then one of its other big games is Fishing Superstars. So you kind of have these two Korean companies operating, kind of making the same games, making RPGs and fishing games, and they're also quite keen on baseball games. Baseball being big in certain parts of Southeast Asia. But they're just generating the money from completely different places, and but both of them are just making massive amounts of sales. So Com2uS, his sales were up 188% in the year, and Gameville sales were up 79%, and both of them they expect next year to be kind of equally as growth worthy. So it's kind of interesting to see that these trends are happening, and hopefully next week we'll have some more financials to dig into. See you next week.